Okay, yeah, great. So we are definitely happy to have more people on board there. Because of time constraints, we ended up not going with the multi-site approach in this first iteration, but decided to get high availability only by the HA plugin. And we're currently testing that. I mean, as expected, there are some issues that we have to resolve in our infrastructure and everything, but in general, we are quite happy how it works so far. Yeah, so that for once, and that of course means we are currently very busy with everything, but that doesn't mean that we won't. We want to definitely spend time on that, and it also means that for us, at least until we can go with multi-site, this will be some time, because of course we have to do the migration, deal with all the aftermath. Something like that never goes completely smooth, and in that time, of course, we can't do like another massive change like introducing a multi-site setup. So, but we have it on our plan. So since it was like originally our plan, we of course also want to pursue that later on. So we are happy to see that people want to work on it. Yeah, and happy to see the contributions. And hope that we can get it in a way that our current setup is still supported next to multi-site, so that it's basically not enforced. But I think that
just shortly explain our current setup.
The current setup isn't that we will have a stateful set with 2 pods running a primary Gerrit using the high availability plugin and to forward events for indexing and stuff. For that, we use the JGroups implementation because there is basically an extension to that can communicate with the Kubernetes API server to get the peers. So we don't have to statically configure anything. We use global RefDB, so within SAP, we use the spanner implementation that we contributed to ensure that NFS caching issues don't affect us too much in regards to getting split into split brain situation because of concurrent concurrent ref updates. Because the repositories are actually stored in a shared NFS volume. While most parts of the site are dedicated to that primary Gerrit pod, to each primary Gerrit pod, that means indexes, caches, and so on are not shared. We also have a stateful set running Gerrit replica pods. They can be scaled to a higher number. So the highest that we currently have in production for one of our largest projects is 5 replicas. And that works without issues. They look at the same shared volume containing the Git repositories as in primary. So that's basically our way to share the repositories between primary Gerrits and Gerrit replicas. So we are not using replication. And the operator also sets up the network routing. So in our case, we are using Istio, but the operator also has built-in support for the Nginx ingress controller and Ambassador. And here there's some automated routing logic. So if you use HTTPS, fetches and clones will be sent to the Gerrit replica, and all other requests basically will be sent to the primary Gerrit. And that way we allow basically easier scaling for fetch and clone requests, which are usually hitting us most. So we have a similar setup already on a Docker basis for one of our productive instances on bare metal. So made quite good experience with it, with splitting that workflow directly for sharing the repositories via the file system. Yeah, so this is basically what we have set up right now. Yeah, and there is separate. So another part, a smaller part, is, for example, Git garbage collection jobs, and that the operator also installs. We also noticed that scheduled jobs like auto abandon and account deletion and so on don't work in this setup because they run concurrently, because the configuration for all instances is the same, so the schedule is the same, and Gerrit can't deal properly with it. So we see a lot of errors. So we actually plan to move those scheduled tasks also into Kubernetes cron jobs, triggering them so that they are just run by one Gerrit instance to avoid this issue. Yeah. Okay, Alvaro, you.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining this and for the presentation that you did in the summit, because it's brilliant. So I have a quick question now that I'm looking with you. Is the Git repos are shared by primaries and replicas, but the primaries do the write and read, and the replicas do just read, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's really Gerrit running with, I think it's container.replica equals true. So this is also enforced. So they are read-only. And the operator has some validation logic inside that you can really only have one stateful set running primary Gerrits, and the other one has to be a replica and so on. And then the operator forces the replica option to be true. So setup is implemented quite opinionated in the operator. Yeah. Because otherwise, of course, we would probably run into conflicts. And so as far as I know, also the high availability plugin, at least when using JGroups, is still limited to 2 primary Gerrits. So you can't have more, although we also have plans to change that. But we decided just to keep our scope reasonable to first go with 2 primaries and then later look at being able to scale them more. Sasha?
Yeah. On a side note, something I like always to highlight with this architecture here is that when you offload git clone and fetch to replicas, then you have much better opportunity to tune JVMs for primary and for replica, because long-running Git operations are known for high memory allocation, and you need to configure Java GC for good throughput, where stop the world of several seconds doesn't really matter if git clone takes 2 minutes. Where on the primary, you want to optimize Java GC for like very short pauses because of you want responsive UI. And that turned out to be impossible task to configure in one JVM to provide both high throughput and short pauses. And yeah, this is what I like to highlight, to keep that in mind, that this architecture of splitting read-only operation into dedicated replicas, this gives us much better opportunity to have responsive UI.
Yeah, and from our experience on the Docker-based setup, we see that this is really helping a lot. So we have less pauses caused by the Java GC then, because we have one type of workload on the replicas, which is the heavy lifting, and all the requests where response time is important is now running on the primary.
So we have a dedicated JVM team at SAP. Maybe you know there is also something called SAP Machine, which is a JVM produced by the SAP. And with help of them, we had several rounds trying to tune Java GC in a single Gerrit, so to serve UI responsive and to have good throughput for the long-running operations. We never succeeded with that. Even with like having a physical machine with 1 terabyte of memory, doesn't help.
Yeah. Okay, Diego? You are still muted, Diego.
Yeah, again, thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask you about for example, in here in this diagram, the ingress provider. You basically support for different technology, right? And we were just playing a little bit with Istio, and I wanted to ask you, based on this high availability architecture, what are your thoughts on that? And does also the k8s operator need to support all of them?
Yeah, so I would say, as many things in Kubernetes, Istio is mostly made for microservices. So there are actually some things that just don't fit Gerrit very well. There's one option, for example. So Istio tries to take care that the single proxies and they take care of the containers are evenly distributed between the managing the Istio pilots, so the managing component of Istio. And for that, it does a reshuffle on a regular basis. And actually, that leads to disconnection of all requests running those proxies, and that will be shifted to another S2D. And by default, it does that every 30 minutes. If you have a long-running clone, it gets killed after 30 minutes max. So that's where we had to do some fine-tuning to just say, okay, just do it once every 24 hours, because anyway, for Gerrit instance doesn't scale a lot, so you probably won't scale up and down multiple times a day just because of how long Gerrit takes to start on a large site. And this is just an example where you see, okay, it was not made for having such a big stateful application in mind. But so far, it works quite well for us. Of course, we currently only have Gerrit replicas in production. So pure Gerrit replicas without any primary Gerrit. And for the other, we are currently in the testing phase. So we have stakeholder testing on a staging instance, and that's basically the state we are in. So far, it serves us really well with that. But for example, the concerns that Luca wrote with more extensive as checking backup servers and so on, there's definitely support for that missing, because it's done in mind having microservices and that are pretty much stateless. So losing one doesn't matter that much. So they are rather saying, okay, just throw it away and get another one. This is more the principle. So yeah, there are definitely the downturns, and it might be that in the end turns out that some limitations are still hard to deal with. So far, I mean, we started out with the Nginx ingress controller. That's why it's also still in there, because we wanted to not just drop support, although it's very limited in its functionality. For example, SSH support, we can't just provide because it's not supported. But then noticed, okay, more complex routing just doesn't work. So we went with Istio because it's quite common at SAP. And we could get all that running so far. And yeah, trying to avoid to have like a custom HA proxy in between that complicates routing. And Istio also provides relatively good implementation of mutual TLS, so cluster communications, which we also would like to use, for example, to not have to authenticate between requests between applications in our cluster. So if you do replication in the cluster at one point, because we have multiple sites, for example, then this should not rely on basic authentication. But yeah, maybe, so bearer token would be an option, but MTLS within the cluster might also work. I mean, that also requires some changes in Gerrit. And Istio provides you with all that functionality already. So that's why we basically went with that. Yeah. And yeah, then Musab came in and asked whether we could support Ambassador because they are using it at their company. I said, we can certainly add it to the operator. So the way it's done, it's quite modular. So you could add other supports as well. And basically, it's an operator level configuration. So you tell the operator on startup what kind of ingress provider it should support, and it will only load that at runtime. So it will only support one at a time. So that makes it quite extensible, I would say. So that works quite well. But of course, if we have 10, it's hard to keep them all at the same state. So I also agree with that. So the first we would likely drop is in the ingress controller, because it's just very limited in the functionality. And what we have right now, we mostly configure via annotations, adding custom Nginx configuration, and that's not a nice way of doing that.
Okay. One follow-up on that. Obviously, you don't use only that for the ingress, I guess, for our system. You're still using that internally with the virtual services and the destination routes and everything. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. That's great. Alvaro, do you want to add something on this topic?
Well, one of the questions that Luca suggested, we were doing some tests just for ourselves to try to understand some things. And actually, this is coming with a question that Luca made, is that, so when we have a pod that is not ready, so it marks as a not ready, so that pod is taken out from any service, no port, cluster IP, or headless service. So what does it mean? That there is no inbound traffic, call it HTTP, SSH, or whatever, and there is no traffic between the pods. So this is coming because Luca raised this question: what happens if you have a Gerrit instance that is not ready for any reason at some point? So then you want to cut the incoming traffic, I mean SSH and HTTP. However, you want to keep doing replication behind the scenes. So do you face these type of problems, or would you suggest? Because I remember that you raised that with J groups you can provide intercommunication between pods. So yesterday we were wondering if you faced that problem, and if you did, how do you do that? Or if you didn't, but you have any ideas, how would you do that? Because I think it's something, Luca, that we want to provide, right? So the pod Gerrit is not healthy, so or is not ready. So there is no traffic. However, we want to keep that instance running, catching up with topics, with another communication. So I don't know.
Yeah, so far we didn't have to deal with that, but that's definitely something to support. And as I did some quick research after Luca posted that, and it doesn't seem like this is supported. I guess that's because, as again, Kubernetes is made mostly for microservices, which are mostly stateless. So it's just meant, okay, if it's not ready, kill it, get a new one, and hopefully it's ready. Of course, with Gerrit, that is not as easy to do and might even be dangerous regarding the data if you just do that. The idea that I came up with how you could deal with that using Istio is, if the operator knows that and basically can detect that there's a state, it's not completely healthy, but we don't want to shut it down. Maybe it's some additional health check plugin REST API endpoint or so. The operator could, for example, set a certain label to that pod. And what you can do in Istio, you can define destination rules based on labels on the pods. So you could just say, okay, don't send any requests to the pod with that label. I mean, this is just an idea. I don't know how well this works. Also, I mean, there are then also multiple components involved. How fast is it, and how resilient and so on. This would have to be tested. But that's at least the idea that I came up with. But yeah, we definitely would need a way. Gerrit has to tell somehow I'm in that state so that we can detect it. I don't know who was first, Diego or Sasha?
Doesn't matter.
Sasha learns.
Okay. I just didn't understand the background of the question, so I just want to confirm I understand why. What would be one of the examples? Why would you keep Gerrit instance running if Kubernetes would like to restart it?
Well, I don't. The question is, and I'm not saying that Kubernetes wants to restart, because you have a pod that is not healthy. Sometimes this doesn't mean that you want to restart it. It's just basically you don't have incoming traffic.
To add some multi-site support to the k8s operator, right? And the first thing is that we were trying to actually replay the demo, but it didn't work for us. And I think the problem with that is that in the documentation, we are missing some of the prerequisite resources. They're listed, but for example, we don't have all the secret for like a reference, let's say, implementation, a reference configuration. Also, because the current operator can have obviously different setups, different configuration of these high availability that you just showed us here, right? So we were wondering if it's possible to have one that is working, documented, so that we can get, basically we can see under the hood what the operator does when we do it. And obviously after that, we have a follow-up question on how would you go about adding multi-site supports. From what I understand that you previously said in the you were already planning this on the presentation that you did, and we wanted to know if you did anything or how would you go about it. And then obviously we had an initial approach that we would like to share with you.
Okay. Yeah, the difficulty of providing a working example is that there is just some dependency on the infrastructure, right? That's mostly storage and some networking. Where it's hard to give sensible defaults because they highly depend on the cluster that you're using. I mean, we can certainly work together, and I can also look. I mean, I still have the configurations used in the demo. I can go through them and also send them to you, especially with some comments. And certainly we should then also update the documentation for that. I mean, that's clear. It's always, if only a few people work on that documentation, certainly miss. And we all work in a pretty standardized Kubernetes environment. So we're using Gardener as a tool to provide Kubernetes clusters and develop as SAP. So yeah, those differences might occur. But we would certainly like to help you there. Alvaro, did you want to say something?
So, regarding this topic, I think what I think could be great is, I know that there are some cluster infrastructure things that probably you cannot share, but what we were thinking is something that we can run in Minikube, something that probably whoever pick the demo, so all of the steps, and you can run everything, and you can have like a fully end-to-end simple mode, primary replica, something simple. We don't need to have all the combinations. So you go there, you can play, you can follow the steps, and you can have all the cluster running, and then you can start basically interacting or checking how the operator works, how this custom resource work. Yes, we don't need to think in a cluster in Kubernetes, in GCP or AWS. Something in Minikube, like a minimal setup, I think would be amazing. Yeah, probably we can even, maybe we can have a demo between us or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we could do that. In my experience, Minikube also has some issues. There is even an old Minikube for the setup for the Helm charts. I think it wouldn't work anymore because it's also not very well maintained for the reasons that we just didn't use it very well. The main issues, I guess, in Minikube is networking. So I don't know if Istio would work, but having at least a minimal setup without any networking and so on, that should work, I guess. Yeah. Diego?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can set it try to set it up again as best as we can. Maybe we can reach out to you if we encounter some issues. As you say, that was something with networking or the Minikube. We didn't try the Helm charts approach. That's straight, obviously, because we wanted to see the operator in action, basically. But yeah, if we can reach out to you, if we have basically faced some blocker, that would be great.
Yeah, the Helm charts are actually also, we see them as deprecated. I also mentioned that in the talk that we would not continue to work on them. So they are, in the meantime, also lacking functionality. So they are not setting up the same, basically. So just because we can't maintain both, and the operator can just do more than the Helm charts can. But there are Helm charts to install the operator, and they already help a lot to configure at least those, the operator deployment and so on. And that's, of course, supported.
That's great. One thing that we know. Yeah, sorry, Thomas. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you a question about the way that you basically init Gerrit. On the Gerrit operator, we have kind of 4 different customer source definitions, right? In your setting, from what I saw. And one that is for Gerrit, basically you have another image that's actually initialized. And we wanted to know why of this approach, if it's just for flexibility, so you can add basically a list of plugins that are supported, instead of having something that basically enforce immutability. It was, I don't know, we wanted to kind of know the reasoning behind that, or if there is like the main advantage is flexibility, or we should go another way.
So the main reason why I have a separate, I created a separate container for Gerrit init is that, I mean, I wanted to fully automate the startup of the Gerrit instance. So including if you set up a fresh site, there is basically no site, or you upgrade between versions, so there's schema migration and so on. As far as possible, this should be completely automated. So I added a set of Python scripts and that perform a certain check. So do I have to maybe do a reindexing run? Do I have to run an init? Isn't there maybe a new plugin version that I have to install? And here, for one thing, for flexibility is, for example, that you can download plugins. We are not using that because we have our own Gerrit build, and we are packaging all plugins in the WAR file. So we are anyway, so it's not that mutable. But since in the upstream community, I doubt that a lot of people are doing that. So they are only using that for the core plugins, but download the other plugins. So this should be automated. So that script does do that as well. And I run that as an init container just to not have to package a complete Python setup and so on into the main container, so to keep it leaner and the scope smaller. That's basically the reasoning. I believe that part of this might actually, in the end, also be built into Gerrit itself. So in the init process, this might also be a possibility. At least when I started out, I mean, the k8s-gerrit project was quite small, and we also didn't know to go. So I was also hesitant to add a lot of stuff to the init process, and that might be quite specific to run it in Kubernetes in an automated fashion. So also leaving that outside that was also part of that.
Just to recap, basically, you build the plugins and the WAR at build time, not at runtime. So you don't download at runtime, but you pre-build everything, you bake in everything to the image, and then you run the image.
Yeah, at SAP, so internally, yeah. And then we can just run Gerrit.war init, install all plugins. And we always get that, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's also why we are interested, for example, to have the same for lib modules. I mean, especially when we go in the direction of multi-site and so on, this becomes more.
Yeah, actually, after the cross plugin dependency change, it was merging stable 3.9. I believe that, for instance, multi-site will not need lead modules anymore. So you will be able to do pretty much all of it except one, really possibly just the Git repository manager that will still be needed to do as the budget, but everything else can just be a plugin.
Yeah, that will make things already easier. Yeah, but for example, yeah, we have to symlink the SAML plugin. So for example, so we are using SAML at SAP.
That was a mess. Yeah, I agree.
So all that is basically done then by those Python scripts. So there's an option to just say, okay, this is a plugin, but I also need it as a lib module. Then the Python scripts will symlink them into place, so you don't have to do anything manual in the site. Yeah. So because if you don't do that, so if you have to do something manual to get the site prepared and so on, this gets quite messy, especially when are you in a running state and so on. So this should all be automated as much as possible. And those scripts are doing that, yeah.
Yeah, and we also wouldn't get security approval if we would do stuff like that manually.
Okay. If there are no further questions to that point, maybe let's go into our plans for multi-site.
Well, wait, yeah, keep going. Sorry,
So, I mean, we didn't really start on that because we started looking into how multi-site works, trying it out, reading our ways through that, and but then in the project planning, we saw, okay, we probably won't be able to do that in the projected timeline of us having to move our productive Gerrit instances and went with high availability. So there were basically two concepts that we were considering. One was we might, depending on how well NFS will perform, we have to see whether the current concept works at very high load on a larger instances, especially if our instances still grow. And then it might be an idea to not share the repositories, at least between primary Gerrits, but they use multi-site for each instance. But that, of course, also adds quite a lot of overhead and a lot of additional storage needed because you have to replicate the repositories X times. The other idea is, of course, something that we also have in mind, that we would also like to provide multi-regional support. I mean, a lot of our stakeholders are sitting in Asia or the US, and they are currently we are running in one location. So multi-site would provide us with that capability as well. So that's more like what you have for Gerrit Hub, right? So, those two scenarios we had in mind and for those we could use multi-site.
Our initial goal is actually not to do a, let's say, proper multi-site setup, but basically is a sort of HA similar to this one, where we just don't have the share file system. So basically, they are still in the same site, they are still the same stateful set exactly as you drew there, but we don't have the NFS. And they have no ability, no, let's say, infrastructure in place for really doing a efficient and affordable share file system. Either they make it very, very efficient, but then the cost is going to be prohibitive, and they're saying, listen, Gerrit is going to cost a fortune. It's going to cost so much compared to a traditional on-premises setup that basically we need to think about if we really do Kubernetes or not. And the second thing could be maybe they can have at affordable prices. However, it's going to be so inefficient. When I say so inefficient, it means tens of thousands times slower than a local file system. But if you really want to be more efficient in terms of cost, then the share file system option is an issue. Definitely in terms of performance. So we have seen that the latencies of pull replication, specifically when you use the apply object, could be so small that actually the fact they're using replication is basically transparent. So you don't have an issue anymore. And we have an experience actually of a client that migrated from HA to multi-site. Is a kind of not proper multi-site. It's a multi-site within the same site. So it's basically not multi-site. It's HA without sharing the file system. And the results, they were amazing. So they increased their throughput massively. What honestly has really impacted slightly is the latency of the updates. The latency of the updates have been slightly slower, but everything else is way faster than what it was before with NFS. So that's the type of initial, let's say, improper multi-site we are targeting. So looking at we were looking at basically taking whatever k8s-gerrit does today, and I believe Alvaro and Diego had some doubts, so I believe you clarified them. Some of the difficulties, I believe, they were related to the infrastructure. So you were running on Gardener, they were trying to run your Minikube. So if you can help out, that will be useful. And one of the first steps for us will be basically rebuilding something similar to this, but without the shared file system. So just by relying on pool replication. So using global FTP, relying on pool replication, pool replication out of the box can work with them, even without the broker at the beginning, then we can add the broker later on. And at the end of the day, should be able to do whatever you're shown here. So maybe the first step will be create an initial change where we add pool replication and we have the shared file system as optional. So it means that if you want to have it, you have it. If you don't want to have it, then you can rely on pool replication. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. I mean, this is basically also describing the first idea that I wanted to describe. So there we actually planned the same for the same reasons. So what if we can't get an efficient enough shared file system, right? So then, yeah, multi-site is the way to go to share stuff. So that was also our idea behind that. Just for time that we said, okay, we take the risk with the shared file system. We trust in our provider, and yeah, thereby save some implementation time, because we are quite familiar with the high availability plugin, but not as much with multi-site. So it's just
you'll find that there are many similarities. Actually, many things are in common. So the multi-site was an evolution of the HA. So there are many things in common. The second thing with the first step will be actually without the multi-site plugin, just with the pool replication. Then the second step could be adding multi-site. So maybe the second step could be adding event broker for events. Don't rely on SSH stream events anymore, because I believe even here you have the problem of the SSH stream events. So imagine that you have someone connecting through Istio, but then Istio connects you, I don't know, to one of the two primary. And then for whatever reason, one of the two primary goes down and gets restarted. Then, of course, your client will be disconnected. We'll try to reconnect. We'll connect to the second Gerrit primary. And the events in between, they're lost. So that's the major issue. If you rely on PubSub, then you don't have the problem anymore, because basically whoever is producing the events, they will be sent, they will be received. So there is no issue anymore. And once you've got pool replication and the event broker in place, then you can add multi-site. And when you're multi-site, of course, you've got also the other goodies.
Yeah, definitely. Event broker is also something we are looking at, because restarting one node always has potential issues. I mean, the high availability plugin will try for some time to continue forwarding the event, but if you are unlucky, that just fails for any reason, and then you are just losing events even in that regard between those nodes. So having an event broker in between is definitely also something that we will look into soon. Just to mention it, if you talk about future plans, you would also like to get rid of an index per site, having a shared index. Just because creating an index is, especially if you want to auto-scale Gerrit, it's just too expensive. It takes too long. And same for the caches. That might improve the setup, but we are also aware that this would likely not work with multi-site as how multi-site works right now. Sasha?
Yeah, when Luca mentioned event broker, I mean, this reminds me on all our discussions in the past. I mean, this opens the whole new possibilities, right? Once we have it in the game. So the example you mentioned with stream events, you can also apply it to whatever other, for example, pull replication, because the responsibility to send messages on the side where an update happened. If it doesn't succeed, you don't know actually what will happen in there. With event broker, once you put that event, it will eventually be delivered there. This also opens possibilities of thinking of decomposing Gerrit into smaller services once we are in such environment. So so you have Gerrit primary, which will maybe only run UI and write operations. Then you would have replicator nodes, which just look for events to replicate this from here to there or something like that. Yeah. Or maybe indexing, once we have index, like managed indexing service and not using like Lucene. So you can have like indexer nodes also, which could scale up and down and so on. So once we have pub/sub, many possibilities are open. Of course, this is all like a bit long shot, but Gerrit as such, as a monolith, needs to be decomposed to be used to efficiently use resources in Kubernetes.
Yeah, I agree. And also for the reason that you mentioned before, just in this diagram, for instance, you have a lot of advantages of having different JVMs because you can add different settings. But not just that, even you avoid, let's say, the ripple effect of one to the other. So how many times we see on these people, they are saying, listen, why the GUI is not responding anymore? And maybe some CI build start doing some builds. And in your case, you will be isolated because the GUI is on the left, then the clones are on the right, and they are really isolated.
And
Alvaro?
you can like restart one without affecting the other. And
yeah, so the question related, for example, with the pull replication idea that Luca had as a first task. So I was wondering, do we want to extend the current operator with a new CRD, so custom and resource addition, that is a, let's call Gerrit cluster multi-site, and we take it from there and we start creating a new Java code that is going to be responsible of that, and is going to reuse some models that is already used in the Gerrit cluster? Or would you suggest to the current Gerrit cluster and all the breakdown components to touch that piece of code? Because it looks to me that maybe I don't know how easy it's going to be for us to start adding the pull replication in the current Gerrit cluster CRD. What would you suggest?
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, we of course would like to keep that setup as it is right now working because we are using it. And then it depends. I mean, I'm open to both approaches. My experience while developing the operator is if we now start with a different CRD and later then you have to migrate between those CRDs, this can also turn up quite messy depending on what the state is. So I would prefer, if it's feasible and manageable, to keep it in the same, as much as possible in the same CRDs. But this will need some work because currently, because we plan with that setup, there is just some logic that is tailored for that. For example, currently the NFS volume is required because that's how it's set up, but that doesn't mean that we can't change it. We can change it and say, okay, if it's not there, so we can also just say in the Gerrit cluster, we give it an option mode, high availability or multi-site, and depending on that, the reconciler does different things.